Give us an idea of how markets across the board fared last week. Was there a key trend that we saw coming through?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, with Africa, we always should take the step back and say, what is the global situation? And what we saw last week globally was risk appetite. You know, risk return, it started the week a bit dodgy, but then obviously as people got more comfortable with Europe and then the non-farm payrolls in America coming out really strong on Friday, we really saw a rally. The way that manifests in Africa typically is you see improved volumes as well as improved performance. So typically most of the indices were up. We had a couple down, but mostly it was a trend up.
Mostly a trend up, and of course Egypt faring very well last week, was the best performer, up by 5.7% in dollar terms. Why a reversal in the softer trend that we were seeing?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we've seen the soft trend for the last few weeks now. What we've seen there is it's obviously a very liquid market, so a lot of international as well as local players. They're obviously getting a new government and they're going to be sworn in. So we've seen a lot of demand both from international and local players into that market.
Yeah, so of course very much geared to what we saw on international markets last week, and they're all bouncing once again today. Namibia, an interesting market coming through there with some gains. Is that just also once again strongly correlated with international news flow?
Yeah, it's strongly correlated to international, but it's also very strongly correlated to South Africa. I think they were actually, you know, lockstep with the JSE. So absolutely, they just follow the indices up or down.
We're seeing what happened in Mauritius just today. The market slipping back slightly there. NMH, of course, a big cross driving volumes last week. What are your thoughts on that stock at this point in time? A huge reversal in the gains that it made for last week.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right. There was a big cross, I think it was Wednesday last week, which sometimes can skew. You know, particularly a market like Mauritius, which is not the most liquid. You know, it's not too bad, but it's not the most liquid. But what we've seen with hotels, and Mauritius in particular, you know, Mauritius is very closely correlated to Europe. Obviously, there's strong connections there. And obviously with hotels, with the Euro crisis, with the global crisis, obviously holiday makers are slightly down. So the hotels are slightly struggling, I'd say.
I mean, that's been the same story for some time now. Are they presenting levels at this point in time that would be attractive if you were, you know, seeing into the future and looking at a recovery in those tourist numbers and, of course, increasing capacity there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. You know, we often advise people, you know, if you like a stock for a specific reason, and obviously if your prediction, as you're right, it's got to change at some stage and holiday numbers have to increase again. Yeah, so I totally think if you can get some stock in, then why not? You know, it might make a good long-term
But you don't know
play.
how much lower they're going to go, though. That's the question.
Yeah, but if you can time the bottom and the top every time, then obviously we wouldn't have to work.
Exactly, that's very true. The BRVM, of course, not very liquid, but it is one of the markets that came forward last week with gains. What are your thoughts on the key stocks that you should get exposure to in that market right now?
Well, it's a difficult one. You're right. It's a very illiquid name, a very liquid market. There's only really one stock that trades pretty actively, and that's Sonatel, which, as you know, is a telecoms operator in that region. You know, last week it wasn't very liquid, and we saw drives up in agro processing and some of the telcos. But really, the stock you want to play there as an international investor is Sonatel.
Sonatel, that's the key stock, obviously because of liquidity.
It's
scale.
Purely liquidity, yeah.
Purely liquidity. On the other end of the spectrum, we had the Zim mining index coming through as the worst performing market for the week, down by 5.1% in dollar terms and local terms. What are your thoughts on this Bandura rights issue and helping to actually recapitalize the miner?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, Zim mining, as we know, is only 5 stocks, so it's very lumpy in terms of the way it trades. And recently we've seen Rio Zim up 5, 10, 20% every week. So it's been very strong. Rio Zim didn't actually change this last week, but you're right, it was driven by 2 stocks. Bandura, which you're right, the rights issue seems to have not been very well received. You know, and there's also media reports coming out there of salary payments not being paid, etc., which is not what you need. You know, it just creates a sentiment around the stock for the negative. And then also Falgold was down, which was interesting because it didn't actually trade. It's one of the vagaries of African markets, but it traded at 35 cents. There's an offer at 30 cents in the market, no trades, but it closes at 30 cents. So very interesting. So
technical glitch there, is that what you take it down to?
Absolutely.
Any exposure in the mining sector right now, given all the uncertainty at this point?
Well, I think what we saw was there was such a massive sell-off earlier in the year. There was so much uncertainty with the indigenization rules, etc. So the name sold off a lot. So we did see people picking up stock when it was lower down. Obviously, that's rallied a lot thanks to Rio Zim, which seems to be trying to address its previous problems. So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely opportunity there.
And of course, I was speaking to Kenya earlier, talking about the NSC and the performance on that end, the market slipping back slightly last week. There has been some profit taking because the market has been one of the strongest performers this year. Do you have any sector favorites right now?
Well, the thing again, you know, you always, for us particularly, we're brokerage, obviously, you know, you look at volumes, and I think you look where the most liquid stocks are, and obviously it's the banks, you know, and then it's the breweries, East African breweries, Safaricom, etc. You know, the banks have actually had a tough time. I mean, there was a lot of the drag down last week. There's a lot of foreign supply, and obviously foreign participants are so big on a lot of these markets that they drive sentiment, you know. So there's a lot of negative sentiment around banks.
Is that justified though?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the results came out and they weren't quite what people were expecting. So I think it did sort of weigh on that, you know. But yeah, it's interesting. You know, it's still a stock that, you know, or a sector that we quite like, because again, they're the bigger stocks, and when foreign participants come in, they typically look into those sectors. And
NIC Bank, one of the standout banks that fell back last week. Your thoughts on NIC within the banking space and resilience there, given it's not one of the larger ones?
Well, exactly, you're right. It's not one of the larger ones. So it's always very difficult because it doesn't trade nearly as actively as your equity banks or your Kenya commercial. So it fell back, and, you know, there was poor demand for the rights issue. So obviously then the demand for the actual name just fell off.
Yeah. Zambia also a standout in terms of the laggards, down by 0.7% last week. When we're talking about Zambia, there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to government policy, government direction. There does seem to be some positive steps, though, that have been taken. From a stock market perspective, has this impacted sentiment and flows at all?
No, I'd say it hasn't. You know, again, it's a very illiquid market. It's not the easiest to trade. It's quite difficult, actually, in terms of a lot of the logistics around trading there. You know, to give you an example, you can cancel a trade the following day, which is quite weird, you know. I mean, just if you want to cancel a trade. But no, it's very difficult. Again,
so you go home, you have a sleep on it, and you realize, oh no,
it wasn't a good trade.
It wasn't a good trade, and that's fine.
Absolutely, yeah. So no, and again, there's only a few stocks that really trade. You know, it's your Zam Beef and your Zam Sugar and maybe Copperbelt Energy. So there's only a couple of stocks that really trade. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we see flows where obviously people are buying, I think they buy the macro story or they sell the macro story. And then once you like the macro story, then you can look at individual stocks. But it's very difficult to gauge because it's not.
Do you have any preferred stocks, though, in the Zambian market?
No, well, again, it's the biggest stocks.
The biggest ones, like Zam Beef.
Zam Beef, Zam Sugar, Copperbelt maybe, yeah, those type of names.
Thank you.